Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I suspect more people are going to be coming in over the next few minutes, but we will go ahead and get started. My name is Flyntt Leverett. I'm impersonating Steve Clemens today. Steve sends his apologies. He is effectively without a voice today, so he has asked me to step in and serve as moderator for the discussion today, and I am very, very happy to do that. I've admired Vali Nasr's work for a long time, and this latest book from him is another, I think, very important contribution to public discussion of all of the issues wrapped up with how the United States deals with the Islamic world, and that is certainly a very timely subject. Let me say a few words about Vali before I turn the floor over to him. Vali is currently professor of international politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts. He's also serving as a senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, President Obama's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Vali had a very distinguished academic career before coming to Tufts. He was a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He's taught at the University of California, San Diego, and at Stanford. He's a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He's been a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. As I mentioned, he's published numerous books dealing with the Islamic world. The most recent before this one was The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future, which I think remains a very important book. But the reason he's here today is to talk with us about his newest book, Scratching Beneath a Bleak Middle East, The Rise of a Muslim Middle Class. I think it has a very, very important thesis and a lot of rich analysis of important and interesting cases to support that thesis, and I think we'll have a very good discussion after Vali talks with us for a few minutes. And for those of you who haven't picked up the book, it will be available for sale at the end of this event right out in the hall there. So I think we'll have a very, very good time this afternoon. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Vali Nasr to speak with us for a few minutes, and then I'll moderate a discussion afterwards. Thank you very much. Vali, please.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Flyntt, for that very kind introduction. And I would like to thank New America Foundation for inviting me here. I have many friends among the fellows, and it's always good to be back here. I'm sorry that Steve hasn't been feeling well. Hopefully he'll recover soon. Anyways, I want to talk about sort of a new trend in the Middle East, one that I think is worthy of our attention, and it's important to think about it as we think about the larger issue of relations with the Muslim world and where the Muslim world is heading. Now, since events of 9/11, the issue of the mood in the Muslim world, the direction of thinking in the Muslim world, the way in which it thinks about the West, it thinks about its own future, have been a major preoccupation of policymakers, of media, of academia in the United States. The issue of extremism in particular has been one that we've thought a lot about for the past 10 years. It's worried policymakers. There's been all kinds of discussions about what it means, what direction it can take, and what it is that the West can do about it, and occasionally we've thought what the Muslims can do about it. Now, the issue of extremism is a serious one. It's the focus that goes on it is important, but sometimes it is all-consuming. Namely, it becomes the beginning and end of all discussion about the Muslim world, all of our understanding in terms of the region stretching all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific and 1.3 billion people gets narrowed down to this issue. Now, as serious as it is, in some ways it's not the only important trend happening in the region. There are other trends, and my argument is that those other trends, even though they may not be as newsworthy or as prominent in headlines or not as loud and clear, are significant and potentially will be much more important in contending with extremism than anything else that we've thought about. And most of those, in my opinion, revolves around economics. Now, at some level, we understand that economics does matter. There's been plenty of discussion about the fact that many Middle Eastern, many economies around the Muslim world are closed economies. They are not job producing. They are dominated by a public sector, that they stifle real economic growth. They don't encourage entrepreneurship. They don't provide a forward-looking opportunity. And that combined with the demographics of the Muslim world, which is particularly young, where country after country you have 60% plus of the population categorized as youth, makes for a very dangerous mix of declining real economic growth, of absence of job opportunities, and increasing poverty and frustration. Now, we think that this has a lot to do with extremism. I mean, you can look at any newspaper and it draws a very direct line between poverty and joblessness and unemployment and absence of opportunity and popularity of extremism among the youth. And there's some evidence to support that. I mean, first of all, when you have too many young people, it means always instability of one kind or another. I mean, that statistic in of itself should be worrisome. It may mean one thing in Iran, it would mean something else in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or the Arab world. And I always remember years ago when I spoke to the parent of a volunteer to fight jihad in Kashmir in Pakistan, and asking, why would it be all right for him to go and die and put his life up for this cause? And the father's answer was that, let him go and die in jihad. There is nothing for him here. There is no future. There's no prospect. At least if he dies in jihad, he dies an honorable death, and he will bring honor to his family and to his village. That's more than what he can do with his life. So, which suggests to you that there is these issues of poverty and the closed nature of economics in the Muslim world is an important one. And the answer to that usually is that, okay, what we need to do is to just pump money, if you would, particularly development money, and particularly money at the bottom rung of the society in order to alleviate poverty. And that's important. But the economic question that came to my mind as I was looking around the Muslim world is a different one. It's not just about poverty alleviation. It's much more. It's not about the lowest class in the Muslim world, but it's actually about the middle class in the Muslim world. And we think about the Muslim world in terms of a lot of statistics or a lot of concepts. But one which is important to note is that one of the things that distinguishes the Muslim world is that large parts of the Muslim world is outside of global economy. It's not participating in global economy. Now, by that I don't mean that, we don't buy oil and they don't buy finished products from the United States. I mean that large parts of the Muslim world are not integrated into the global supply chain in the way in which countries in Latin America or Eastern Europe or East Asia are integrated into the global economy. Now, the consequence of that is that large parts of the Muslim world is lacking in what we would call an independent middle class. A middle class that is rooted in market activities and whose economic, political, and social position is connected to the role that it plays in globalization and the global economy. So in my conception, I mean, if you ask economists, they would tell you that the simplest definition of the middle class is that middle rung of the society that is neither rich nor too poor, and that at least has a third of its income, that has steady jobs, steady employment, steady income, and at least can spend a third of its income on things other than basics, which is housing and food. And then you can go up from there. We can look around the Muslim world and find plenty of very wealthy middle class in Saudi Arabia, in other Arab countries. But that's not the middle class I'm talking about, because that's a middle class that is not producing wealth. It's living off of wealth in society. So the wealth comes from government handed down, either through entitlement programs, salaries, or contracts. But this is not a wealth generating middle class. So in that sense, it's not really a middle class in the sense that historically we understand the middle class. Now, why does this matter? It matters because that, more than Islam, in my opinion, is the big distinguishing factor between the Muslim world and the rest of the third world. So when you look at Latin America, you look at East Asia, look at Eastern Europe, areas that used to be the third world, used to have the same GDP level, the same kind of problems. And even in the case of Latin America, the same kinds of extremist problems in the form of communism, guerrilla warfare, etc. And you see that, the main sort of historic force in those parts of the world is not secularism, is not sort of the kinds of debates we have about the Muslim world. It's integration into the global economy, even though it's not been a happy integration always, but it's integration nevertheless. And the consequence of that integration is the emergence of a middle class that acts and behaves like historically middle classes have behaved. And history here is important because we often, when we engage in the West in a historical debate with Muslims, it's about religious reform. So, we talk a lot about a reformation of Islam or finding a Muslim Luther, and that might be very well put. But we often forget that if you looked at European history, if you look at Scotland or Netherlands, where, Reformation first took roots, it's not Reformation that made Scotland the seat of industrial revolution. In fact, Scotland under the early Reformation was kind of Taliban's Kabul. It was intolerant. It was extremely puritanical. It was extremely rigid, and what transformed Scotland was commerce and trade. Was the rise of a middle class that was tied to commerce and trade, and the history of Europe that the Muslim world should follow. Most importantly, is this history rather than the religious history. Now, having said this. If you looked at the Muslim world, in my opinion, there is good news. In other words, in the past decade, for a combination of reasons, you've had a certain degree of integration into the global economy in some places, and you've had the rise of the kind of the middle class that I'm speaking about. It's not dominant in the Muslim world. It's still not trend-setting. But when you look at the evidence, first of all, it's present, and where it's present, you see the right dynamics. It's not present in sort of the heartland of the Middle East very much, but in the peripheries, in places like Indonesia, like Turkey, but even in the Arab world, the example of Dubai, for instance, speak very loudly about this. Now, when I was doing research for this work, I went looking for the footprint of this middle class, and why it's there and what are the consequences. Now, let me begin with Dubai in some ways. Now, these days it's not fashionable to tout, Dubai's virtues. And I think Dubai's phenomenon is quite interesting. But I'm not going to be talking about Dubai as a business investment opportunity. That it's a place to go and put your money and do things. Although I think what is important to note about Dubai is that Dubai is failing because of bad capitalism, but is failing because of capitalism nevertheless. And the mistakes of responding to too much wealth by making bad investments is not limited to Dubai. Plenty of companies did it during the boom of Nasdaq, and plenty of financial companies did it also during the boom in the financial sector in the United States. So I mean, Dubai is falling exactly because it behaved in a very capitalist way during the height of the boom. But what's most interesting about Dubai is not that whether or not it's found a model to be to be able to give returns of 20% a year on investment infinitely, or whether or not it's managing its debt properly. What was most interesting in Dubai is that Dubai decided that in order to be able to make money, and because it's the poorest of the sheikhdoms of the Persian Gulf, where it actually doesn't have very much income from oil, it had to come up with something else. And Dubai created a regulatory environment that would allow those who did business in Dubai to integrate into the global economy. And it has a very small population of maybe at most about 200,000 people. But it created a virtual environment where all the Muslims who couldn't engage the global economy in their own countries could engage the global economy in Dubai. And the result is that you saw the kind of entrepreneurship that you wouldn't associate necessarily with economic behavior in the rest of the Muslim world. So Dubai became a place where Iranians, Pakistanis, Indians, Kazakhs, Lebanese, Jordanians, etc., could engage the global economy, particularly the financial sector, but also other aspects of the global economy with the British, Europeans, etc. So Muslims began behaving very much the same way as others would, given the right regulatory environment. Now, the other side of Dubai was even more interesting. Dubai, for a while, and it's still probably true, became the most coveted place for Muslims to go visit. I mean, polls found out that Muslims would rather live in Dubai than any other country other than their own. For the first time, Dubai exceeded London or the United States as a destination for living. It also began to exceed any other destination in the Muslim world for vacations. Now, who would go to Dubai for vacations? It's typically the profile of a middle class who goes to Dubai for vacation. Now, they want to go to Dubai not because Dubai is some kind of a puritanical Sharia land. They want to go to Dubai because Dubai became a cross between Las Vegas and Disneyland. And they began, those who had disposable income, significant disposable income in the Muslim world, showed that, as middle classes, they engage in middle class behavior, which is consumption primarily, consumption of good life, consumption, and as good restaurants, good malls, good hotels, high quality of living. And Dubai became, if you would, the imaginary, consumption capital for the entire Muslim world, not because it represented jihad or extremism or some kind of Islamic puritanical ideal. It wasn't the fundamentalist dreamland. It was, if you would, a Muslim, if you would, capitalist dreamland. It became the imaginary place for the Muslim middle classes. And I have a line in my book when a Saudi businessman told me that what he likes about Dubai is that you stay at 5-star hotels and you pray at 5-star mosques. So, wealth requires wealth. And in that sense, Dubai very much showed that middle-class culture in the Muslim world is not puritanical. Middle-class culture in the Muslim world is very close to middle-class culture everywhere else. It's largely defined by personal interest and economic interests and quality of life interests of those who have wealth, which means by sort of looking at it the other way around, that the absence of this middle-class culture everywhere else is part of the problem, so to speak. Now, having said that, it is one shouldn't confuse middle-class culture with secularism in the Muslim world. Namely, the middle class that I'm talking about is not necessarily liberal in terms of social values or women's issues, etc. Nor is it necessarily secular. In fact, the opposite. It is very religious, but its religion is somewhat different. And here I would give the example of Turkey, which is if Dubai shows what the Muslim classes can consume and what is their, if you would, living standard values, etc., Turkey presents a very different picture. Now, Turkey was the bastion of secularism for many years. It was Kemalism dominated there. But the Turkey that we see today, as a member of G20 countries, as a Muslim democracy, or democracy as much as the Muslim world has been able to achieve, and the Turkey that is, the business and tourism mecca for the West, was not an achievement of Kemalism. The Turkey's economic boom had to do with a very different process, which is Turkey in the mid-1980s was a bankrupt country with a huge amount of foreign debt and a mismanaged economy. The Kemalist state dominated the business sector. It was dominated large industries in much the same way that, say, in Egypt or in Algeria, government dominates the public sector. Turkey did the same thing that Argentina and Brazil and Mexico did at the same time. It went to the IMF and asked for help. And the IMF forced on Turkey a very strict economic regimen. It told them they had to reduce their tariffs, they had to devalue their exchange rates. The money they got from the IMF has to go into shutting down some of those large enterprises. Money had to go to small businesses that could produce something that the rest of the world would buy. And under their legendary prime minister and later president, Turgut Özal, Turkey undertook these. And in fact, it did it probably more successfully than some of the Latin American countries did. Now, this opening created a new business class in Turkey that were not the old Kemalist business class, but actually was a new business class that came from below. Let me give an example. It probably illustrates this much more. Business in Turkey in, say, the 1960s and 70s was associated with Istanbul, the same way as in the Arab world it's associated maybe with Cairo, Amman, Algeria. And these were sort of secular businessmen tied to the state, benefiting from state patronage, etc. When this restructuring came, money began to go somewhere else. If you've been to Turkey, south of Ankara, there used to be a little town called Kayseri, where the current president of Turkey, Abdullah Gül, comes from there. Now it's a big industrial hub. Kayseri was in the middle of nowhere. It was a very small town. But when the restructuring came, local businessmen began to take advantage of government loans to establish new businesses that were export friendly. I mean, today when we speak, Kayseri is one of the world's largest producers of denim jeans, denim 4 jeans. About 7% of the world's denim jeans are manufactured in Kayseri. I mean, one company accounts for about 1% of all denim jeans. It's a massive exporter of furniture from Turkey, and varieties of other things are made in Kayseri. And there are many other places like Kayseri. Now, when you go to Kayseri, it's much more like Middle America, if you would. It's religiously conservative, but it's very capitalist. These businessmen all go to mosque. There's a very big, opulent new mosque. Going to mosque is kind of like Rotary Club is in other settings. They all do business at the mosque. There's long line of Mercedes-Benzes, latest Mercedes-Benzes parked in front of the mosques on Fridays. They all support the same causes, etc. They're all fiercely pro-Europe because that's where their market is. They're all pro-democracy, and they are all pro-business, but they are socially conservative. But what's important is that when you dwell on the religion, you understand that a businessman who sells leather directly to Ferragamo understands that jihad is not good for business, and these businessmen are not interested in religion as social action or as political action. They're interested in religion as values, an ethical compass, and as personal piety. And that's why actually the message of the AKP party, which is essentially their party, sits very well with them. They care about the fact that the leaders of the party are pious, but they don't believe that they need an Islamic state in Turkey, or they don't believe in religion as a political cause. I mean, years ago, when I was at graduate school, I had a professor who worked on religion in Latin America and used to say that Brazil is becoming Protestant because Brazilians, particularly middle class and businessmen, don't like Catholicism because Catholicism asks of them to become politically engaged and to fight for poverty and to fight against imperialism. That it's become a religion of political action. And because they didn't want that political action and they wanted personal piety and they liked the passion of religion, they all were becoming Pentecostals. They were opting out. And you have that sort of a phenomenon here. So the Islam that's coming with this class is the Islam of businessmen, is the Islam of the wealthy, and it's a very different attitude. And it's not because we're preaching it to them. It's because their business interests are represented in it. Now, but nevertheless, it's a religious. This is a religious community. I mean, these businessmen in Turkey are not, on the par of gender equality. They don't probably mark very high. They're still very beholden to conservative Anatolian, values. They're still, are partial towards, religious rhetoric. By no means are they secular. And in fact, if you looked at Turkey, the essence of this argument becomes very clear, because in Turkey you have two middle classes today. You have the one that's left over of Kemalism, which is secular, sees itself a lot closer to the West culturally. And then you have this new middle class, which is religious, is not product of Kemalism, but it sees itself closer to the West economically and politically, because it supports market capitalism, globalization, integration into Europe, and now the Democratic Party. And there's another big difference. When about a year ago, there was a rumor that the Turkish military may intervene to prevent Abdullah Gül from becoming president, because he was seen as to being too religious. I asked one of these very powerful, wealthy tycoons, Muslim-oriented tycoons, about what did he think the result would be. He said, it won't matter. I asked him why. He said, because in Turkey, we pay for the government. Every government would have to listen to us. It's our money, the money that we generate, that pays for Turkey. So it's a very different dynamic. In Turkey, in a sense, has a middle class that is wealth generating, that its taxes, its export revenues, and the jobs that it creates accounts for why Turkey is a G20 country. Whereas, and therefore that middle class is able to sort of project its power. Whereas in many other countries, when you have a relationship, when the governments really don't need money that is produced by the middle class, either because they get a lot of foreign aid, or they have commodities, oil, etc., that generates wealth directly for the government, there is no need for this phenomenon. Now, does this middle class mean sort of a liberal Middle East in the short run? The answer is no. But that might not be an important thing. I mean, it's very clear, as I said, that it's religious. If you looked at, its social habits, what sort of television programming they watch, what sort of, values they promote, what sort of causes they support, it's clearly not secular. But what's important, it's not extremist either. For instance, if one of the new phenomenon that is very prevalent on Arab satellite television are the sort of a new breed of Muslim televangelists. Probably best, there's many of them, but probably the most popular of them, but well known to many because he also visited Washington, is Amar Khalid, who actually lives in London. He broadcasts his show on 4 different satellite television channels, and he's quite popular. But, Amar Khalid's message is conservative. He supports women wearing the hijab, etc. But his Islam is more about morality than political action. In fact, he actually is completely devoid of political action. And he supports, living in harmony with the West. He supports a sort of businessman's Islam. And even his own style and demeanor of appearing in 3-piece suits and polo shirts during sermons speaks volumes. And if you looked at who fills the halls when he gives his large sermons in the Arab world, it's by and large people who track to this middle class. So in the short run, we shouldn't necessarily expect secularism from it. But at some point, maybe that's an irrelevant question. I mean, ultimately, the question is not whether or not the middle class is secular. The question is whether the middle class supports shared global values around economic and political issues, whether they have a vested interest in the stability of the global economic order and in wealth generation everywhere. and whether or not they support, they serve as a counterweight to extremist interpretation of Islam within their own societies. And the answer is yes, they do. And if one country we would sort of look at is Indonesia. I mean, if you went back to 2002, during the time of the Bali bombings, we would have looked at Indonesia then pretty much as we may look at a typical Arab country threatened by Salafism and Al-Qaeda. It had a very large radical organization, Jama'ah Islamiyah, which we believe was tied to Al-Qaeda, was tied to seminaries within Indonesia, that was trend-setting extremism across Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to southern Thailand and Malaysia. That was quite aggressive in terms of terrorism, not only Bali bombing, but also attacks on hotels in Jakarta, etc. And then you fast forward to the past year and a half since there was elections in Indonesia, and it's very clear that Indonesia has gone in a different direction. That, yes, there still is a terrorism. There was only an attack on the Marriott Hotel again last summer, but Jama'ah al-Islamiyah has basically been atrophied, if you would, in terms of its presence. Not just because there is a great deal of security pressure on it, but because it's not making any headways either among the young or the broader population. And that the general mood of the country, as it was shown in the presidential election, is not supportive of fundamentalism. Fundamentalist parties lost ground, and in fact lost ground in direct competition with the president's party. And that, again, Indonesia is religiously conservative. Legislations are passing that are limiting many kinds of free expression, but it's also at the same time moving away from extremism. Now, again, if you looked at Indonesia during the past, it began before, but during the past 10 years has been integrating much more into the global economy. Its oil production has gone down to the point that it's actually thinking of coming out of OPEC. And it's relying increasingly on export revenue generated with the outside. And therefore, that has creating a middle class in Indonesia that is increasingly beginning to dominate the political discussion in Indonesia. So, on policy issues, on religion, on social issues, on a vision for Indonesia's future, it is no longer hardline clerics or the lower and lower middle classes that are deciding the debate, but it's the middle class that is deciding the debate. Now, the long and short of what I'm saying is the following: that if we're thinking, what is the force that will ultimately change the Muslim world, it's not going to be an enlightened cleric or a reformer or an intellectual reformer. It's going to be businessmen. And ultimately, the most important force that has yet to be unleashed in the Muslim world with its tremendous amount of transformative potential is the force of markets and the force of the global economy. Anyways, I'll stop there and be very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Vali. There are a lot of really interesting and important ideas that you've put on the table for us. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask you to reflect a bit on the policy implications of your arguments for the United States. And I want to ask you about two specific aspects of that. One is, and Turkey is a very good example, whereas this new Turkish middle class has become empowered, the AK party has become really the dominant force in Turkish politics. This has also been linked to a very, very interesting period of transformation and innovation in Turkish foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And while I certainly take your point that the Turkish businessman who supplies leather goods to Ferragamo has a very immediate understanding that jihad is not good for business, nevertheless, the fact that Turkey under the AKP has taken its foreign policy, particularly its foreign policy toward the Middle East and other parts of the Islamic world, in directions that don't always jive with American policy preferences, seems to be very, very popular in Turkey. And I wanted you to reflect a bit about what the rise of a Muslim middle class, the way that you've described it, could portend for the foreign policies of countries where this happens. The second sort of policy question I wanted to ask you to deal with is, what does your analysis mean for, I think, what's still in some ways a residual American attachment to democracy and political liberalization as the key to getting something, quote unquote, better in the Muslim world? And here I have a specific example, the country you know far, far better than I do, Pakistan, where under Musharraf in 2002 there were very controlled elections which produced a technocratic government. Shaukat Aziz, a finance minister who won, Finance Minister of the Year from Euromoney magazine, as prime minister presided over this unprecedented period of economic growth and development in Pakistan. But from an American standpoint, that simply wasn't good enough. And so the United States, decided to turn against Musharraf and push for a different kind of political constellation in Pakistan. What is it if this is what you think is an important and positive trend in the Muslim world? What does that mean for U.S. policy in terms of its historical preference for democratization? Then we'll go to the floor.
Very good questions. First of all, generally, when we think about the Muslim world, we don't factor in economics at all. We confront short-run problems, and we're compelled to look for immediate solutions. Economics is always a much longer problem to address. And in the case of Turkey, it was the IMF that started the process, and therefore, it had the effect because the way the IMF looks at things. If you looked at some Middle Eastern countries, IMF gave them the same prescription, for instance, to Egypt in 1977, and Egypt was able to sort of circumvent those because of ability to garner assistance from the outside. And IMF program of 1977 was not even begun to be implemented until 1997. So whereas Turkey didn't have that luxury, or Dubai didn't have that luxury, or Indonesia didn't have that luxury. But it requires a different way of thinking about regional issues, what is the force of change in the region, etc. But bottom line, when we put our mind around it, it's not rocket science. We're not reinventing the wheel. In other words, we can look at how countries in Latin America, in East Asia, in Eastern Europe, and even some Muslim countries have been transformed. It requires massive economic restructuring. You have big bloated public sectors, which is pretty generic. Doesn't matter if the country is Islamic, Arab, socialist, communist, Latin American. You have inefficient, large public sectors that the government doesn't want to reform or cannot reform, doesn't want to shut down red ink industries. They're not investing in export promoting ideas. And ultimately, that's something you have to fix. We've done it elsewhere. And the process is not always smooth. It doesn't always go well. There were a lot of hiccups in Latin America, and there still are, or in Eastern Europe. And, Asia went through the Asian financial crisis. People who criticize Dubai today forget about what happened in Thailand and Malaysia, et cetera, for similar reasons, in other words, excess. But, once we get there, it's not as big an issue. The second issue is that obviously our focus is always on the most troubled cases, because either that's where the most amount of, extremism, terrorism, threat is, or because there's the most degree of humanitarian problem and most degree of, pressure on the economy. So, a lot of our economic thinking is directed at maintaining the bottom from falling apart. Whereas we might have to think that we have to do that anyways, when we should do it. But sometimes you have to also focus on success cases, countries that are closest to crossing the line to create more winners. We're not geared that way. In other words, our economic engines are not geared right now, are looking around the Muslim world and saying, which countries are closest to Turkey, which countries have the greatest potential of, within the next 10 years being close to Turkey. And that's an issue we have to focus on. Now, regarding democracy and liberalism, I mean, the example of Turkey or even Southeast Asia would suggest, and also parts of Europe, is that it's much better to get the economy right first before you get the politics right. Because ultimately, democracies are most stable where you have not only affluence, but you have a stable market economy. And a market economy, in particular integrated into the global economy, would demand certain degrees of openness, rule of law, compatibility of legal structures globally, etc., that would necessitate certain degree of pluralism. We cannot time it. I mean, there are countries like Tunisia that are able to resist major political restructuring despite a great deal of wealth. Korea and Taiwan did it for a long time. But there was a tipping point. There reaches a point where ultimately the pressure on legal reform, etc., would necessitate a much more whole-scale political reform. It's very clear that it's very difficult to get economies going when you don't have democracies going when you don't have stable economies and the like. Now, in the case of Pakistan, actually this is what happened. The government of President Musharraf began to unravel when the middle class in Pakistan said they don't want dictatorship. We all forgotten about the lawyers' movement. It's not us who made the change. In fact, maybe we didn't even recognize the force in Pakistani society at the time. Pakistan went through periods of 7% growth during a decade. Now, whether this was real growth, not real growth, end of the day, it began to grow very rapidly. Pakistan also has export industries that are globally competitive in textiles and varieties of labor-intensive things. And during that period, the middle class in Pakistan began to find its voice. It found its voice culturally through open media, and it began to put pressure on General Musharraf. Now, the thing about Pakistan is that this happened maybe this cycle of economic wealth generating democratic demand happened more quickly than it ought to have happened, and that the state had many other vulnerabilities, including ethnic tensions, civil military tensions, the presence of a war next door, and then extremism in the country, tensions with India, etc., that wouldn't allow this to work. And still, if I would say, okay, if we really thought past a year or two of troubleshooting, in the long run, what is the force that can transform Pakistan? And I mean, in the short run, you may come up with many different candidates as solutions. But in the long run, Pakistan can only really find its way if it goes the way of India. I mean, India hasn't solved all the poverty problems. But end of the day, India is transforming because there's that middle class that is now defining politics and culture inside India and is connecting India to the global economy. Now, on Turkey, clearly the more democratic Turkey becomes, the more varieties of aspects of its policy are going to reflect, public mood in the country, from, foreign policy to domestic policy, etc. And we're not going to like everything we're going to see from this middle class. But we should not keep moving the goalpost. I mean, at the beginning, we just don't want terrorism. But the minute we get no terrorism, we say, now, that's not enough. We want this, and then we want that. The reality is that, actually, when it comes to, issues of defying U.S. foreign policy, I think the Brazilian president did a far more, vocal job than did the Turkish prime minister vis-a-vis Iran. And the reason in both cases is probably trade. I mean, we also forget that Turkey is now becoming the biggest, if you would, regional economic player. Construction companies across Central Asia, a great deal of food and manufacturing export into the Arab world. And as it's going in these areas, it's beginning to rediscover its own sort of Middle Eastern roots, and it's finding that it has to be in tandem with the region. Now, also this is not a one-way street, just like with others. There's going to be failures. There's going to be hiccups. The global financial downturn didn't help, for instance, in varieties of sectors, and therefore, this doesn't mean that, this is going to be an automatic success case. As the case of Pakistan you mentioned, there was a lot of hope. And then, there's now been sort of a collapse into a morass, and it's going to be difficult to get Pakistan back to where it was in, say, 2007 in terms of its economy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. A couple of people have already caught my eye, but when you're recognized, I'd ask you please to introduce yourself by name and affiliation, and I'll try and get as many of you in as possible. Let's start over here, please.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us. My name is Charles Kestenbaum. I served 25 years as an American commercial diplomat in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Dubai. I have two questions, since Flyntt can ask two. One is, what are you advising Mr. Holbrook? And particularly about Pakistan, because I'm an advisor to the Board of Investment of Pakistan, and I'd love to be able to try to do something that you would like us to do. My second question is about your model of middle class. It's a great model. I certainly lived it myself there. But, if you look at for every guy that some father in Pakistan sold his kid for money to the terrorist groups to conduct an attack in Mumbai, there's Ayman Zawahiri, who was a doctor. There's Osama bin Laden, who was a wealthy man. The 5 Americans who just were picked up in Pakistan didn't come out of poverty. So I'm not sure that it's simply economics that dictate, but rather perhaps other issues, alienation, a sense of Islam's identity. So would you address that?
Yes. Regarding your first point, I can't comment, other than to say that, obviously a great objective is to, create a sufficient stability so that the economy can begin to go and produce back to where it was. But the second point is a very good point. And my answer is this, is that terrorism is always a middle-class, wealthy phenomenon. It always is. Look at Berkeley. Look at the Weathermen. Look at the Badr Meinhof gang. Look at the, even the Palestinian, PFLP. I mean, George Habash was a medical doctor from Johns Hopkins. The point is not that, and that's what I'm saying. Sometimes first of all, we confuse the generals from the soldiers in this fight. Number one, Che Guevara was from a very wealthy family, and he pontificated on how the peasants should sacrifice their lives to make revolution happen, and he knew better what was good for them than they did. Secondly, we confuse insurgencies with terrorism. Insurgencies have a very different dynamic than whether it's there's a big difference between Badr Meinhof gang and the Viet Cong, or the Khmer Rouge and the Red Army Brigade in Italy. But the kind of nihilistic violence that Al-Qaeda stands for, which is sort of much closer to that kind of European terrorism, has always been a middle-class phenomenon. The question is not whether you're going to find 15 middle-class or wealthy kids who are willing to kill themselves and kill other people. The question is whether the country as a whole or the middle class as a whole supports terrorism. So, wealthy Germans were capable of producing terrorists, but the German middle class was not willing to support terrorism, and that's why they failed. Indonesian middle class is capable of producing terrorists in a country of 250 million. But the point is that Indonesian middle class is no longer willing to support Jamaah Islamiyah. And that's the key. Now, why is that the key? Is because the middle class, who's vested into the global economy and is vested into the image of Dubai, etc., begins to be the definer of the political debate in those countries. Now, you can look at many mechanisms. I mean, you look at a country like Turkey, or the majority of the television and newspapers are now owned by tycoons, and those tycoons are not interested. They're interested in sort of soft opposition, etc., but they're not interested in promoting these kinds of views. So the key issue is not individuals. We're always going to find individuals that are like Ayman al-Zawahiri, that are like Che Guevara. They're going to be wealthy people who, for varieties of reasons, see their mission in violence. Or you're going to find movements that relate to nationalism or alienation or frustration as a whole. But the more important issue is whether the overall population is subscribing to that view, whether the core debate at the middle is focused on this issue or not. So you want to get the Muslim world to where the Germans or or in others, the majority don't support these ideas.
Okay, we'll come over here, please.
Hi, Ben Deering, Department of Energy. It's interesting. I saw your talk reminded me of the not a bumper sticker, a pin in my cab on the right over. It said, "A society can only rise as far as its women." And I was thinking some of your opening remarks kind of sounds like, well, an economy can only rise as far as its women. And I wondered, in your research and travels, what are the trends or possibilities for the economic, social emancipation of women in the Middle East that could kind of bolster this movement?
It varies very widely from country to country, and yes, it's an issue. I mean, ultimately, if you have the majority of the population is not participating in the economy in a meaningful way, it does create many limitations. But the argument I would make is that it would be the integration into the global economy and the improvement of that sort of middle class that will end up being an engine for addressing gender issues as well. Some countries are better endowed with it. I mean, sort of older Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, etc., had either during the secular period or otherwise had a very different profile for their women than some countries that were, from the very beginning did not have women's literacy or had a much more segregated population. So yes, I mean, so long as women are not emancipated or not educated or not participating in the economy fully, it creates very clear limitations on the capability of the economy to grow. But that's not going to go away in a vacuum. There's not a single argument you can make to any country that would say, well, do this. It's as powerful as if you told them, unless you change these 3 financial laws, banks are not going to come to your country, right? So, right now, most of the places are not changing those laws. So, your argument goes the same way. But, once the countries begin, or once you have a force within them which is interested in bringing those banks, then the argument goes that, the size of your market is going to expand this much more, or the size of your, skilled labor force is going to expand this much more if you invest in education, etc. And then the other side of it is that you want ultimately middle-class values to permeate. I mean, there are sociologists who define middle-class values as believing in small family and investing in family, not looking at family, not looking at children essentially as instruments for economic activity or old age insurance, but believing that, family is kind of like a business unit. If you invest in it, you grow it, it will be more prosperous down the road. There are few places in the Muslim world that they have absorbed this. For instance, Iran, ironically, is actually much more, even at the village level, has imbibed these kinds of values. So you have, small families, whether you're in a village or in a city. But, middle class values, you have to figure out where do middle class values, whether it's about extremism, about women, about politics, etc., where are they going to be nurtured? And then you want to make them universal.
Okay, we'll go the gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, formerly of State Department, now University of Wisconsin, Washington semester in International Affairs. Picking up on this idea of values, you had mentioned earlier shared global values. I'm wondering about the value of empathy, particularly in regards to what seems to me, to what I'm able to see, is a fair amount of indifference to the murder of fellow Muslims around the world, either in Darfur or bombings in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, other places. I mean, I can understand to a certain level the degree for bombs against the Americans, those seen as invaders. But it seems I get a total indifference to the murder of fellow Muslims.
Well, because largely because these issues are, if you would, discussed in a context of West versus Muslim world context. I mean, because you're asking him these questions. It would be very different if these questions were internal. I mean, in large ways, the current discussion, political discussion in the Muslim world, is being greatly influenced by fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, whose, if you would, global worldview was still a product of the 1950s, 60s, anti-imperialism rhetoric. It's reflected in what they say. It's reflected in the policies of governments, etc. And in that context, that's defined essentially as a struggle of the colonized versus the colonizer, or those who believe they're economically, politically oppressed, and the imperialists. I mean, if you erase the Islamic language, it's pretty much the 1960s rhetoric that pervaded in Latin America about multinational corporations and the United States imperializing. So in that kind of a context, and it was the same then too. If one Latin American country was abusing its own population or killing a neighbor or war, that was an irrelevant question. I mean, the main axis of the discussion ran north-south, and that's still very much there as well. So, Darfur is not a Muslim cause. It's an unfortunate thing. It's not a Muslim cause. But it's become a Western cause. So the Muslims are constantly answering for this. And it's the wrong context in which it has to happen. Now, these things will not get discussed properly unless they're an internal discussion. In other words, if it's a problem for a population within, then it becomes a part of that discussion. So it's a matter of context, in other words.
Okay, we'll come to the gentleman here.
I'm Irfan Malik with the Pakistan American Public Affairs Committee, and my question is about Pakistan, which I believe is the focus of Obama administration foreign policy. The question I have is, we talked about empowering the middle class. What are the U.S. policy with the Kerry Lugar bill and other assistance to empower that middle class and provide assistance like a Marshall Plan or something similar to build up that class rather than giving assistance to the government or the public sector? And attached to that would be not just the economic, the monetary part, but what sort of tariffs and other things that U.S. and other Western countries can do to build up that class. You mentioned Turkey producing denim, but Pakistan manufactures jeans. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of economic activity that can be built up by just changing tariff laws and tariff rules for that country.
Right. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on current U.S. policy because it's not the context in which I'm here. But these are important issues that definitely deserve attention going forward.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman right there, please.
Vali, wonderful talk, really interesting. Two questions, if I might. One is, would you apply the format you've been describing of a transition, middle class, et cetera, to Iran today? Is Iran a pattern? Does it fit the pattern, or is it an example that doesn't fit the pattern? And is the wave of extremism that came through Iran and where the extremists took over, is that in some sense an obsolete pattern? We probably won't see that happen again. Was it a middle class phenomenon in some sense or not? My second question, if you permit me. You made a very important distinction between insurgent and terrorist. But U.S. policy in the region tends to blur the two. And we tend to think that one leads to the next. We're fighting the Taliban in country X, I won't mention which one, in order to prevent terrorism, Al-Qaeda, from blossoming further. Is that a false connection that we're making, not just don't apply it to any one country, but as an intellectual issue, are we off base by saying one transitions into the other?
Okay, Vali, you want to take the Iran?
Well, if the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was greatly facilitated by the secular middle class in Iran. It wouldn't have happened without the secular Iranian middle class, and that's actually a theme I discuss in the book. But the example of Iran would be that it shouldn't matter whether the middle class is secular. It should matter whether the middle class has liberal values. Iran's middle class under the Shah did not have liberal values. It talked about democracy, but I don't believe it understood democracy. And most of them, their notion of democracy was really what we mean by democratic people's republics version of democracy. So they subscribed to essentially what they thought was a Marxist-Leninist, would-be Marxist-Leninist revolution, and then they were blindsided by the outcome. But it's a cautionary tale. In other words, what matters should not be whether the middle class is religious or secular, but whether the middle class is equipped to perform the historical role that middle classes are supposed to play, and they played in the West, in the rise of the West, and they have played in Latin America, or are playing in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, and in Asia. So that's what matters, that whether or not the middle class is positioned, has the right economic tools, the right interest to perform the historical role. I mean, for one, I don't believe the Islamic world is outside of history. I don't subscribe to the notion that there's a big Islamic exceptionalism that they can't get it right. But I believe that the problem is that the Muslim world is like a train that is not on the tracks, therefore is not moving. It's not on the tracks of history because the tracks of history are really capitalism, and the tracks of history is really the middle class. And unless you have that dynamic, you're not going to have forward movement. So the rest of the discussion about cultural change, religious change, women's emancipation, all of the things that were the product of the rise of the West are not going to happen in the Muslim world.
Okay, this lady here, please. Yeah.
Well, that one goes on the off-channel. Yeah.
Thank you, Vali. Farah Hatasi, President of the Arab Information and Resource Center. I'm curious to know if you discussed in your book the role of Islamic financing in shaping the new global economy, because it seems it's only the Islamic banks and the Islamic funds that are holding in this, and would you describe a financial institution like the Islamic Development Bank and all their efforts to empower the middle class as one forces of fortune and change in the Muslim world, that we truly hope your theory will really prevail? Because as far as I know, when I travel to the 22 Arab countries, I don't see the middle class. They don't exist, either the rich or the poor. So I hope this movement really moving in the whole Muslim world. Thank you.
No, you're correct. I mean, the Arab world, with the exception of small pockets, is not very high on this scale, and largely it has to do not only because of the environment, but also in many cases because of abundance of oil wealth, which has made it unnecessary for governments to have to open up markets, etc. Yes, I do deal with Islamic finance extensively, and I think Islamic finance is very significant because, first of all, it shows that Muslims are willing to engage in the global financial community, but they want to do so in their own terms. But it also shows the possibilities because, when I was a graduate student, I used to write about Islamic economics, and it was some kind of a quaint idea that, non-economists and clerics, etc., spoke about. It was a pet project of a few governments, and it never worked. It never worked. And we used to have a lot of conferences in Washington, New York about how to make it work. And then, it became big business. The company, the people who made it big business were Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Bank Paribas. They're the ones who made Islamic finance real. They made, and obviously because the financiers are good at, coming up with financial products that they want to sell. I mean, credit swap is one, Islamic bonds is another. Now, but the point was that why would these Western banks put their mind into making Islamic finance a reality? Because they sense the market, and that market is not among just an affluent Muslim class, but it's among the up-and-coming middle class. I mean, in the Gulf, you could say it's all oil money. But, you can go to Chicago, and there was a bank in Chicago a few years ago announced Islamic car loans. And the very first day, it had a line going around the block. Now, people who buy cars are middle class. So there's a middle class demand for a particular financial product. If you offer it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. So, that bank obviously saw a market. Now, once that bank did that, there are other banks who made the competitive product. Now, even last year during the global financial crisis, international Islamic finance sector grew by 29%. So it shows the economic potential, the demand out there. But it cuts both ways. In other words, the Muslims are engaging in the global economy. They want to engage in global economy. They can engage in the global economy, but there's a portion of them, significant portion, which want to bring their values into it. And Islamic finance is a very good gauge of that.
I think we'll have time for one more over here, please.
Hi, Ben Schwartz from the Department of Energy. The concept that markets and development can lead to positive political outcomes isn't entirely new. Sam Huntington famously wrote the book in the 1960s. I think political change in developing societies, in which he argued that actually market penetration could cause instability by raising expectations faster than political and social change develops. How does sort of your theory of increasing capitalist and influence in the Middle East sort of respond to that theory of, well, it actually in the short run can cause instability?
Well, and Huntington actually had a sort of a tip of his finger number that when countries pass a particular GNP level, then they almost the dictatorship becomes unsustainable, and they would begin to open up. I agree with him. I mean, first of all, but Sam Huntington's theory was very narrowly focused on political change, which meant that once you have prosperity in society, although he didn't talk about trade. Prosperity alone is not enough, as we can see, say, in the Persian Gulf. But the globalization has some additional things it brings to the table. Is because it forces countries to have to change the way they do things according to certain standards. So, for instance, China has a set of laws, or Dubai had a set of laws, right? They cannot engage the global economy unless they change those laws. They may resist, but end of the day, the businesses are going to say that you have to have the labor laws that I can live with. You have to have arbitration laws, property rights laws, et cetera, and I have to trust your regulatory environment. Otherwise, I'm not going to put money in. Now, these legal systems, you cannot change one part of it without changing all of it. So you cannot, change the methodology of law in the finance sector without also it impacting your criminal sector and your other sectors. So almost, trade can make if you would, dictatorship unviable, not because of some, values conversion, but because practically you no longer can manage an open economic system with a closed political one. That's what happened in Turkey. That's why a coup is virtually impossible, because it won't work with the Turkish global economy, or Korea, or Taiwan, etc. But I'm talking about something a little bit bigger than what Sam Huntington is. Sam Huntington was only looking at a very narrow causal relationship: economic prosperity, democracy, or instability. I'm saying that actually the entire civilizational change in the Muslim world, which the United States from right to left has been yearning for, is not possible without a whole-scale economic transformation of the Muslim world. And by economic transformation, I don't mean just eradication of poverty and wealth, but means that the way that the Muslim world is integrated into global economy would have to change. And I think then that would cause change of values, it would do change of government, it would make the kinds of changes that would bring the Muslim world into alignment, if you would, on many different things with not just the West, but with other parts of the third world that have become part of the global. I mean, one of the things we forget is that the Muslim world is present in many parts of the world, in Africa, Asia, etc. It's not that the Muslim world is falling behind the West. The Muslim world is now significantly falling behind other parts of the third world. And unless, I mean, in Southeast Asia, one of the reasons Malaysia and Indonesia embraced globalization was because of the structure of ASEAN. Because within that structure, they had to keep certain compatibility with their neighbors. It's the neighbors that forced Indonesia and Malaysia to go in the direction of globalization and then democracy. And then that's the same pressure that now ASEAN is bringing on Burma. So, the point is that, the whole scale sort of getting the Muslim world integrated into the larger world will not happen unless you have them integrated into the global economy. And then so it's not just a matter of wealth. It's a matter of those relationships that trade creates.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap up this part of the encounter, but Vali will be sitting at the table right outside the door to talk with you further if you like, and he'll certainly be happy to sign copies of his book, which, as I said, will be available for sale out there. For my part, I at least had a very, very good time listening to all of this, and say thank you to Vali.